My name is Amber Sullivan, and I'm 28 years old. The night I came back to Santa Ana, I expected an uncomfortable dinner and a week on the couch while I arranged my next move. Instead, my mother pushed an invoice across the table and said, "You owe us $30,000 in back rent. Your first $2,000 is due Sunday, or your car is gone." Before I could ask how she had invented rent for years when I had lived 600 miles away, my father added, "From now on, we're charging 10% interest every month, just like a real landlord." My sister laughed. My aunt called me a bum. Four faces watched me as though they had rehearsed the scene and expected me to beg. I looked at the 12-page spreadsheet, noticed several strangely precise numbers, and understood that someone had built a plan around my fear. I photographed every page, put the invoice down, and stood. I did not defend my career or remind them whose name was on my car title. I packed one bag, took my keys, and left before midnight. 7 days later, my phone lit up at 1 a.m. My sister texted, "Dude, Mom found something in the mail and she's screaming. Please answer." At 1:23, my aunt wrote, "Your mom and dad are here sobbing. Please call them back." They still thought I was the person in trouble. They had no idea the envelope had exposed why they needed exactly $30,000. Before I tell you what the letter revealed and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it where you are? Where are you watching from? And what is the weather like there? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The friend who opened her door to me that night was Emma Reyes, the same person who had once sat beside me in 10th grade algebra while I learned that numbers could expose a lie more cleanly than shouting ever could. She did not tell me to calm down. She made coffee, handed me a blanket, and asked to see the invoice. That was when I finally named everyone involved. My mother, Linda, my father, Michael, my older sister Jessica, and my aunt, Diane, who had spent dinner enjoying my humiliation as though it were entertainment. Emma read the first page, then the second, and frowned. The total was not rounded. The invoice claimed I owed $29,840 in housing, utilities, storage, family administration, and interest, then added a $160 processing fee to produce the dramatic number they had announced. The dates reached back 4 years, including months when I had been working in San Francisco and had not slept in that house once. One line charged me for using the family garage while my car had been parked in a paid lot near my apartment. Another billed me for career support during a year when Linda had refused to answer my calls because she considered advertising work unserious. The document was ridiculous, but it was too organized to be random. "They don't believe this," Emma said. "They need this." Her distinction stayed with me. I had returned to Santa Ana after the agency where I worked merged with a larger firm. I had not been fired despite what Linda had apparently told the rest of the family. I had accepted a severance package and was interviewing for a regional strategy position that would let me work closer to home. I had savings, references, and options. I had told my parents only that I needed a temporary place to stay because I wanted 1 week without turning my life into a presentation. Linda had translated that privacy into failure and used it as permission to put me on trial. At 8:12 the next morning, she called 6 times. The seventh call came from Michael. I answered because part of me still hoped he would apologize for the interest threat. Instead, he said, "Your mother wants the car key left on the kitchen counter by Sunday if you can't make the payment." I asked him to repeat it. He lowered his voice and said Linda had already contacted someone who could move the car quickly. I reminded him that the registration, insurance, loan payoff, and title were all in my name. He replied, "We helped you when you were younger. Don't make this ugly." That sentence ended the last excuse I had been making for him. Silence was not Michael's weakness. It was his method. Linda delivered the demand, and he made it sound reasonable. Jessica texted next, "Just pay something so Mom gets off everyone's back." When I asked why everyone's peace depended on my money, she sent a laughing emoji and wrote, "Because you're the one who came crawling home." I almost answered with a paragraph. Instead, I saved the message. By noon, Emma and I had created a folder called 30,000. Inside it went the invoice photographs, call logs, texts, my title, and every bank statement showing where I had lived and what I had paid during the years they claimed I was occupying their house. Then I searched my email for the family company, Sullivan Property Holdings. My grandmother Evelyn had created it decades earlier with one small duplex and the house where my parents lived. When she became ill, Linda took over daily management. As a teenager, I remembered envelopes, repair calls, and tenants stopping by with checks, but I had never been invited into the business. Linda always said the properties were adult matters and that Jessica understood them better. Yet the invoice included a footer I recognized: SPH Administration. They had used the family company's accounting template to bill me. That choice bothered me more than the insults. I called Linda and asked one question: why is Sullivan Property Holdings on a personal rent invoice? For 3 seconds, she said nothing. Then she told me not to play accountant and warned that Sunday's deadline had not changed. Behind her voice, I heard paper sliding and Diane whispering, "Don't explain anything." Linda hung up. Emma watched my face and asked whether I wanted to go back for the rest of my belongings. I did, but not because I wanted another confrontation. I wanted the old blue document box my grandmother had given me before she died. Linda had always called it sentimental clutter. For the first time, I wondered whether she had been afraid I would open it. That evening, I drove to the house with Emma beside me and my phone recording in my pocket. The front door was unlocked, but my bedroom had been emptied. My clothes were packed into black trash bags in the hallway. The blue box was gone. On top of the bags sat a handwritten note from Linda. First payment Sunday. 10% added Monday. I looked past it toward the garage and saw that my spare car key was missing from the hook. I did not ask whether my own family would really take my car. By then, the better question was how much they were willing to risk to keep me from discovering what the invoice was designed to hide. Sunday arrived with no payment from me. At 6:40 that morning, I woke to the scrape of metal outside Emma's apartment and saw a tow truck backing toward my car. A man in a reflective vest was checking the license plate while another held my missing spare key. For one stunned second, I simply watched. Then the fear Linda had counted on turned into something colder. I grabbed my title folder, ran downstairs, and began recording. The driver showed me a vehicle release form signed by Linda, claiming she was an authorized co-owner acting on behalf of Sullivan Property Holdings. The signature beneath mine was not mine. It was a loose imitation with the wrong middle initial, witnessed by Diane and accompanied by a photocopy of an old insurance card. I told the driver the vehicle was privately owned, displayed the current title, and called the police. He immediately stepped away from the car. The second man tried to hand me the spare key and leave, but I photographed his company badge before he could turn. When the officer arrived, he compared the documents, took statements, and asked whether I wanted the attempted seizure documented as suspected fraud. I said yes. That single word felt different from every argument I had ever lost at my parents' table. It was not dramatic. It was official. Linda called while the officer was still there. I put her on speaker. She did not ask whether I was all right. She demanded to know why I had embarrassed the family over a misunderstanding. I asked why my signature appeared on a release form I had never seen. She said, "Your father handled that," then immediately changed the subject and reminded me that interest had begun accruing. Michael called 30 seconds later and insisted Linda had handled the paperwork. Their stories separated before I even had to push. Jessica texted that I was acting insane, and Diane warned me that involving police would make employers think I was unstable. I saved everything. Emma, who worked as a litigation paralegal, stood beside me with the expression she used when a witness had just contradicted a sworn statement. "They gave you forgery, an attempted conversion of property, and 2 conflicting admissions before breakfast," she said. "Stop treating this like a family disagreement." That afternoon, she introduced me to her supervising attorney, Priya Shah. Priya did not promise revenge. She promised process, which turned out to be far more frightening to people who survived by controlling the story. She reviewed the invoice, the tow form, my title, and the police incident number. Then she asked whether Linda had ever possessed power of attorney for me. The question pulled open a memory I had not visited in years. When I was 19, I spent 1 semester overseas. Before I left, Linda insisted I sign a limited authorization allowing her to renew my registration if necessary. My grandmother had objected. I remembered Evelyn placing a blue folder in front of me and saying, "Read the ending of every document, Amber. People hide their intentions where they think you are tired." I had signed only after the form was limited to 6 months. Priya told me an expired authorization could not legally support the release Linda had used, but it explained how she obtained enough personal information to create something convincing. I asked whether I should confront them. Priya said, "Not until we know what else your signature has been attached to." We ordered my full credit reports, froze my credit, sent preservation notices to the tow company, and requested every document connecting my name to Sullivan Property Holdings. Then I called the storage facility where Linda had once kept company records. The manager remembered my grandmother and, after verifying my identity, told me that a small box had been transferred 3 months earlier to the law office administering Evelyn's trust. Linda had not destroyed the blue box. She had removed it from the house because its contents no longer belonged there. That was the first piece of good news, but it carried an unsettling question. Why had my grandmother's trust lawyer moved records just before my 28th birthday? The answer began arriving in fragments. My credit report showed no new credit card, but it listed a recent business inquiry from Pacific Horizon Bank. I had never applied there. Priya called the bank's fraud department while I listened. The representative could not disclose account details yet, but confirmed that my social security number had been submitted as part of a commercial file connected to Sullivan Property Holdings. My stomach tightened. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because the invoice suddenly looked like a countdown. Someone knew an audit or renewal was coming. Someone needed $29,840 before that happened. At 7:03 that evening, Linda sent a photograph of the empty garage hook and wrote, "Last chance. Bring the money home and we can forget today." I stared at the message, then at the police report beside me. Had they really believed family loyalty meant I would help erase the evidence of what they had done? I replied with 6 words, "Do not contact my vehicle again." Then I blocked every number except Jessica's. I left hers open for one reason. Jessica loved being close to power, but she had never learned how to stay calm when power shifted. If something inside that house cracked, she would be the first person to tell me. On Monday morning, Priya received the trust file. She placed the blue document box on the conference table without opening it and asked whether I wanted a witness present. Emma sat beside me. I lifted the lid and found my grandmother's handwriting on the first envelope. For Amber, when she is 28. Inside was not a sentimental letter, at least not at first. It was an operating agreement, an amendment to the Evelyn Sullivan Family Trust, and a schedule of property interests. My grandmother had owned 60% of Sullivan Property Holdings. Linda owned 20%, Michael 10, and Jessica 10. Under the amendment, Evelyn's 60% transferred to me on my 28th birthday, along with the right to appoint the managing member and demand a full accounting of every company transaction made during Linda's temporary management. The family home was not personally owned by my parents. It belonged to the company. So did 2 rental units and the commercial kitchen Linda used for her catering business. I read the same paragraph 3 times before its meaning settled. My mother had demanded back rent from me inside a house controlled by a company I now majority owned. She had threatened to seize my private car using that company's name, and she had done it days before her authority to manage the company expired. The second envelope held a letter from Evelyn. It was brief. She wrote that Linda was capable, ambitious, and easily frightened by losing control. She wrote that Michael avoided conflict until avoidance became participation. She wrote that Jessica had been taught to confuse proximity to authority with merit. Then she wrote, "You may be tempted to rescue them when the truth arrives. Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened." I felt as though my grandmother had reached through time and placed a hand on my shoulder. The documents rearranged old memories. Linda locking the office, Diane carrying blank invoice books, Jessica boasting about company-paid consulting, and Evelyn quietly building a lock they could not pick. Priya opened the accounting schedule. The trust required an independent review within 10 business days of transfer. A certified notice had already been mailed to the company's registered address, my parents' house, informing Linda that her signing authority would end at midnight Friday. A second packet required the delivery of bank statements, leases, vendor contracts, and tax records. That was the mail Jessica would later mention. But before it arrived, we needed to know what the review would uncover. Pacific Horizon Bank released the commercial file after receiving our fraud affidavit. The application sought renewal of a $180,000 line of credit. My name appeared as a personal guarantor and incoming majority member. The electronic consent had been submitted from the home internet address. Diane had notarized a supporting identity certification. Jessica had signed as company secretary. Michael had signed a resolution stating that all members approved. Linda had signed everything as managing member. The bank had not yet funded the renewal because it required final confirmation after my birthday. Their plan became painfully clear. Present me as broke, demand $30,000 immediately, pressure me into signing whatever they placed next, and use the payment to cover a shortage before the bank reviewed the books. If I resisted, they would take my car, sell it quickly, and call the proceeds a family contribution. The invoice was not merely cruel, it was a financial trap with dinner theater wrapped around it. Priya asked what outcome I wanted. The question should have been easy, but I heard Evelyn's warning. My first instinct was still to minimize the damage, protect Michael from Linda, excuse Jessica as immature, and imagine Diane had only followed instructions. That instinct had kept their system alive. I want the company secured, I said. I want every account frozen against unauthorized transfers. I want the audit. And I want no one warned beyond what the trust requires. We appointed an independent property manager, notified the banks of the ownership change, revoked Linda's authority, and scheduled the accounting inspection for Friday morning. Priya also sent a formal demand prohibiting the sale, transfer, or destruction of company assets. I did not call home. I received the regional strategy offer that afternoon and celebrated something they could not redefine. Emma and I ate takeout on her floor because her table was covered in legal files. At 12:54 a.m. the following Saturday, the certified packet was delivered after several failed attempts, according to the tracking alert. 6 minutes later, Jessica's message arrived. Dude, Mom found something in the mail and she's screaming. Please answer. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear. At 1:09, she sent a photograph of the first page. Linda had underlined the phrase, termination of management authority, so hard the paper had torn. At 1:23, Diane texted, Your mom and dad are here sobbing. Please call them back. Then Michael left a voicemail saying there had been a misunderstanding about Grandma's documents. Linda left one saying we could work out the rent if I came home immediately. They still could not say the words I needed to hear. We used your name. We lied. We tried to take your property. I did not answer. At 1:41, Jessica finally sent the message I had expected. There are things in the office Mom doesn't want the auditors to see. I replied, Do not touch them. Take pictures and leave the room. 3 minutes later, my phone filled with images of ledgers, shredded paper bags, and vendor invoices bearing Diane's company name. On the last page, a handwritten column showed a deficit of $29,840. The exact amount they had billed me was not coincidence. It was the hole they wanted me to fill before I inherited the right to look inside. Friday morning, I returned to the house with Priya, a forensic accountant named Daniel Cho, and the independent property manager. I had not been inside since finding my belongings in trash bags. Linda stood in the doorway and tried to block us with the same invoice she had used at dinner. She is not entering until she pays what she owes, she announced to the neighbors who had begun watching from their driveways. Priya handed her the operating agreement and calmly explained that I was entering as the majority owner of the company that owned the property. Linda's face did not collapse. It hardened. She turned toward the neighbors and said I had manipulated my dying grandmother into stealing the family home. That accusation clarified what apology never would. She was not ashamed of what she had done. She was ashamed that she had lost control of the audience. I stepped past her without raising my voice. Inside the office, 3 filing cabinets were empty, a laptop had been reset, and several boxes had been moved. Jessica sat on the staircase with swollen eyes, insisting she had only signed documents because Linda told her they were routine. Michael repeated that he never understood the company finances. Diane claimed notarizing my identity certificate without me present was a harmless family shortcut. Daniel began with the bank statements Jessica had photographed. Within 2 hours, he found payments to Diane's maintenance company for repairs. Tenants said had never occurred. Monthly, consulting transfers to Jessica, catering expenses charged to property accounts, and cash withdrawals approved by Linda and Michael. The missing $29,840 was only the amount due before the bank renewal. The preliminary unexplained total exceeded $137,000. Linda responded by attacking everyone in the room. Jessica was ungrateful. Michael was weak. Diane had overbilled. I had abandoned the family. Even Evelyn, dead for 3 years, had supposedly set a cruel trap. Listening to her, I finally understood the architecture of our family. Linda created emergencies, assigned guilt, and then offered belonging as the reward for obedience. The invoice was simply the first time she had printed the system on paper. Priya asked each person to preserve all devices and documents. Linda refused and reached for the office laptop. The property manager stopped her. Michael then admitted the missing records were in Diane's garage. Diane shouted that he had agreed to move them. Jessica revealed that Linda had instructed her to delete company emails before the audit. Their alliance disintegrated in less than 5 minutes because none of it had ever been loyalty. It was shared protection from consequences. I could have ended the meeting there and allowed the lawyers to take over, but I wanted one answer. I placed the invoice beside the deficit ledger and asked Linda, "When you looked at me across that table, did you see your daughter? Or did you see $30,000? For once, she had no prepared speech. Michael began crying. Jessica stared at the floor. Diane muttered that the question was unfair. Linda finally said, "I saw someone who owed this family everything." That answer removed the last piece of doubt from me. I told them the terms. Linda's management authority was permanently revoked. Jessica's paid consulting role ended immediately. Diane's vendor contracts were suspended and reported for review. Michael's access to company accounts was frozen. The house would be evaluated because company funds had subsidized their private expenses for years. If they cooperated, the civil process could remain orderly. If they destroyed records, transferred assets, contacted tenants, or touched my car, we would seek emergency court orders and refer the evidence to the appropriate agencies. Linda laughed once, sharply, and said I would never do that to my own mother. I answered, "You tried to sell my car before Sunday breakfast. Do not confuse restraint with permission." She slapped the invoice against the table and said she would tell every relative, client, and neighbor that I had returned from San Francisco to seize a sick woman's business. I told her to tell them whatever she wanted, because the audit would tell the story with dates, signatures, and bank transfers. That evening, the smear campaign began. Family group chats filled with messages calling me greedy. Linda posted that she was being evicted by the child she had sacrificed for. Diane called 3 cousins and claimed I had forged the trust. Jessica shared nothing publicly, but privately begged me to exclude her from the audit. Michael asked me to delay everything until Linda settled down. I answered none of them. Instead, Priya sent one factual notice to all company members and tenants. Management had changed, rent and repairs would continue normally, and financial records were under independent review. The contrast was devastating. Linda had volume. I had documentation. By Monday, 2 relatives had forwarded me messages in which Linda admitted she needed my payment before the bank looked too closely. A former tenant provided photographs of repairs she had paid for herself despite Diane billing the company. The more Linda tried to destroy my reputation, the more witnesses came forward. The revenge I had imagined as anger became something far more satisfying. I stopped protecting the lie, and the truth began recruiting its own allies. Consequences did not arrive as one dramatic explosion. They arrived as appointments, deadlines, canceled contracts, and letters no one could shout into disappearing. Pacific Horizon denied the credit renewal and referred the identity documents for investigation. Without that line, Linda's catering operation lost access to the commercial kitchen because it had accumulated months of unpaid company charges. 2 major clients canceled after learning that deposits had been moved through accounts under review. The independent audit eventually identified $164,300 in unauthorized payments, personal expenses, unsupported vendor bills, and cash withdrawals. Some money had gone to keep Linda's business alive. Some had paid Jessica's credit cards and luxury trips disguised as marketing research. Some had gone through Diane's shell maintenance company. Michael had signed quarterly statements certifying that he had reviewed transactions he now claimed not to understand. The final report did not allow any of them to hide inside the word family. It assigned names, dates, amounts, and responsibility. Diane's notary complaint was upheld. Her commission was revoked. The property company terminated every contract with her business, and the insurer that covered her work opened its own review. Jessica lost her company income and, after lying about her role during a background check, lost an offer from a local brokerage. She moved out of the family home and blamed Linda publicly, then blamed me privately, which told me she had changed sides, but not character. Michael agreed to cooperate in the civil case, surrendered his company interest toward repayment, and moved into a small apartment after separating from Linda. He asked me to describe him as manipulated. I refused. I told him manipulation explained the first signature, not the dozens that followed. Linda fought every step. She challenged the trust, accused Daniel of bias, and filed a complaint claiming Priya had intimidated her. Each attempt failed and increased her legal costs. Most damaging of all, she continued using company money after her authority had been revoked, transferring $18,000 into a new account the morning after the audit began. The emergency order froze that account and barred her from managing, selling, or encumbering any company property. The judge did not care that she cried. He cared that the transfer occurred after written notice. The family home then became unavoidable. For years, Sullivan Property Holdings had paid taxes, insurance, utilities, and renovations, while Linda and Michael contributed almost nothing. Because the company needed funds to repair the rental units and satisfy restitution, the board, meaning primarily me, approved a sale. I gave them 60 days to leave, longer than the law required and far more mercy than the deadline they had given me. Linda called it cruelty. I mailed her a copy of the invoice with one line highlighted: "First payment due Sunday." I did not add interest. I did not need to. The house sold to a couple who planned to live there rather than use it as a family throne. The proceeds restored company reserves, covered tenant repairs, and funded the settlement. Linda's 20% interest was reduced by the judgment against her, leaving her with far less than she had expected. Her catering business closed. Her social circle, built around the image of a successful matriarch, scattered when vendors began asking about unpaid balances, and former employees described how she blamed them for missing money. On moving day, she stood in the driveway and told me I had destroyed the family over $30,000. I looked at the house, the garage hook where my spare key had once hung, and the woman who still believed the amount was the offense. "No," I said. "You priced me at $30,000. The audit priced what you did." She asked whether I felt powerful. I told her I felt finished. That hurt her more than rage would have, because rage would have kept her at the center of my life. Finished meant she no longer controlled the next chapter. As the moving truck pulled away, I did not celebrate her homelessness. She had settlement funds and choices. I celebrated the end of her immunity. She had lost the house, the business, her authority, much of her reputation, and the unquestioned obedience of the people she had trained to orbit her. The heaviest price was not poverty. It was being forced to live without anyone else carrying the consequences for her. 6 months after the invoice dinner, Sullivan Property Holdings looked nothing like the private machine Linda had controlled. Tenants had an online repair system, every vendor contract required verification, and quarterly statements went to all members without secret folders or whispered instructions. I kept my new strategy job and served as managing member only long enough to establish safeguards, then hired a professional manager because freedom was not replacing Linda at the center of the same system. The repaired duplex produced stable income, and I directed part of the recovered money into an emergency fund for tenants facing temporary hardship. Evelyn had built property to create security. Linda had used it to create dependence. I wanted the ending to restore the original purpose rather than merely reverse who held power. Emma moved from friend to chosen family in a way no legal document could define. We kept the 30,000 folder. My car remained mine. I replaced the locks, canceled the old spare key, and eventually stopped carrying the police report. Jessica eventually sent a 4-page apology. The first page admitted she had laughed because humiliating me made her feel secure. The next 3 pages explained why Linda had influenced her. I answered with one sentence. An explanation is not repayment. We communicate rarely now, and only when she speaks without demanding access to my life. Michael attends counseling and sends birthday cards. I do not call our relationship healed. I call it honest enough to remain limited. Diane never apologized, and people eventually stopped listening. Linda wrote to me twice. The first letter blamed Evelyn, the economy, Michael, and me. The second was shorter. She said she had started working at another catering company and understood what it felt like to answer to someone else's rules. She asked whether we could meet. I agreed to one conversation in Priya's conference room, not at a cafe dressed up as reconciliation. Linda arrived without an audience and spent an hour searching for a version of the past in which fear excused her choices. Then I told her forgiveness was not a door she could knock on until I opened it. It was something I might or might not feel, privately, over time. It would not restore her company authority, erase the judgment, return the house, or make me responsible for her comfort. She asked, "So this is my punishment forever?" I answered, "The punishment ended when the court orders ended. These are boundaries." That distinction was the final thing she had never wanted to learn. Before leaving, she asked whether I still had the original invoice. I did. It hung in my home office beside a framed copy of Evelyn's line, "Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened." I did not keep the invoice because I enjoyed remembering the humiliation. I kept it because it marked the moment their story about me became evidence against them. I had walked into that dinner believing I needed my family to confirm I was not a failure. I walked out believing I needed to prove them wrong. In the end, I learned something better. People committed to misunderstanding you will turn every defense into another trial. The strongest answer is not always a speech. Sometimes it is a locked account, a preserved message, a signed affidavit, and the courage to let consequences arrive without interrupting them. Linda had demanded $30,000, 10% monthly interest, and my car. 1 week later, she begged me to return because the mail revealed that the house she ruled, the company she used, and the books she hid were no longer under her control. I did return, but not as the frightened daughter they expected to pressure. I returned as the majority owner who opened every file they had tried to close. They wanted a tenant they could charge, a scapegoat they could shame, and a rescue fund they could drain. Instead, they created the witness who ended their arrangement. Would you have taken the money, accepted an apology, and kept the family home untouched? Or would you have let every documented consequence stand? I know my answer. Family can ask for grace, but it cannot demand immunity. The night I left, I thought I was losing my place in the family. What I actually lost was the role they had assigned me. Everything I built afterward finally belonged to me.